Why would a 21-year-old sit quietly through Bible study, only to open fire moments later?
9 people died that night at Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, June 17, 2015, a Wednesday evening. Inside those walls, prayers were whispered, scripture shared, and then bullets shattered everything.
He didn't run. He let the silence settle, let the horror breathe. And when it was done, he walked out slowly, leaving behind bodies, grief, and a torn America. They called it a hate crime, a massacre, an act of terrorism, and all those labels are true. But none of them explain why. Not in the way I've come to ask it. I've spent my life studying people who commit unthinkable acts, and still nothing prepares you for the moment you look into the eyes of someone like Dylann Roof and realize they once played with toy trucks and slept with a nightlight. He wasn't born with a gun in his hand. He was born with possibilities, like all of us. So how does that child become this? What cracks inside a mind until silence turns into bullets?
What twists a human being so far inward that the only way out is violence?
I still remember the photograph found in his pocket. A faded print of a church he never truly entered, not in heart, not in soul. A place that once welcomed him, and he destroyed. So the question isn't just how he killed.
The real question is,
what makes a child become a murderer? Every killer was once a child. He was born on April 3, 1994 in Columbia, South Carolina. No red flags in the delivery room, no curses in the stars. Just a boy, small, pale, blinking against the light.
But something was already missing.
His father was distant, his mother fragile. Their marriage dissolved before he could even say family. And in the quiet corners of that house, no one noticed when he stopped laughing. There's a memory that surfaces again and again in my mind, not mine, but one I've reconstructed through interviews, court documents, stray remarks. A small boy sitting alone in a messy bedroom. Crayon scribbles on the wall. A teddy bear with one eye missing its stitching torn. Behind the door, raised voices. A crash. Then silence. Children don't need trauma to be visible. Sometimes all it takes is being ignored.
Dylan's early years were marked by transitions, moving, switching schools, staying with different relatives. Each place another fracture. Each goodbye another whispered lesson. Don't trust permanence. Don't expect warmth.
By second grade, teachers noted his withdrawal. He was there, but never really present, like a shadow that followed but didn't play. One therapist described him years later as someone who learned to vanish in plain sight.
And that's how it begins.
Not with screams, but with silence. Not with violence, but with emptiness. The first darkness doesn't announce itself. It drips in quiet, slow, invisible. And by the time someone sees the whole, it's already shaped like him. Was that the first time he decided love was dangerous? He was always alone. In middle school, the hallway stretched like a gauntlet, locker doors, slamming, laughter in groups, sneakers squeaking on the floor. Dylann walked it quietly, too quiet. He wasn't bullied the way movies show it. No fist to the face, no locker shoved shut with him inside. It was worse, he was unseen. The kind of boy no one saved a seat for at lunch. I spoke with one former classmate. She didn't remember his voice, just his stillness. He was like a chair that no one sat in, she said. Invisibility, that's a cruel thing for a child to carry, because children crave reflection. In others' eyes, in their voices, in the way someone says your name like it matters. But his name, it floated unanchored. He started skipping school, playing truant, slipping out of classrooms without a word. The report said he drifted from grade to grade, barely present, but still no one really asked why. Somewhere around age 13, he began wearing the same clothes over and over, baggy jeans, long sleeves even in summer, hair hanging over his eyes like a curtain.
He didn't push to be included anymore. He began to resent inclusion.
And that's when a new seed planted itself. If they won't see me, maybe one day they'll fear me. Years later, in a police interview, he said he remembered school as pointless, but the way he clenched his jaw when he said it told a deeper story. It wasn't that it didn't matter. It's that it mattered too much and hurt every time it didn't love him back. Is that when he first decided, I don't need them? It started with whispers, then lies. At 14, Dylann began muttering to himself under his breath in corners, staring into mirrors like there was someone else looking back. He stopped going to school altogether. Drifted between homes. Spent hours locked in bathrooms, staring at his reflection, cracking jokes to no one. His stepmother said he began talking about strange things. But what's stranger than feeling the world is moving without you? He shoplifted a few times energy drinks, junk food, bullets. It wasn't the stealing, it was the look in his eyes when he got caught. Like he wanted someone to see. There's a pattern I've noticed in deviants before they break the push-pull of shame and craving. They want to be loved, but they can't bear the feeling of being small, of needing. So they flip it. They begin to test the world. He started making racist jokes online. No one stopped him. He slipped deeper into forums' echo chambers that turned his anger into identity. And slowly, he replaced connection with control. He didn't want affection anymore. He wanted dominance. The cracked bathroom mirror tells the story. One face but broken into pieces. Part of him still wanted to be a boy someone hugged. But another part, the growing part, wanted to burn the world that left him outside the door.
And that's how the mask begins.
First to protect,
Then to manipulate.
then finally, to hide what even he can't recognize anymore. When did he stop seeing himself in the mirror and start seeing a weapon?
He learned to smile without feeling. By his late teens, Dylann had become an expert in emotional mimicry. He laughed at the right moments, nodded when people spoke, said thank you in stores. But it was all performance. A mask so well practiced it barely slipped unless you were really watching. He had a job for a while. Landscaping, long hours under the sun, headphones in, eyes distant. The crew called him quiet, polite, just another kid trying to make a buck. But inside, nothing grew.
When I read through his texts from that period, I noticed something odd. Not the words he used, but the way he used them. Flat, disconnected, like someone copying the script of a human life, not living it. He tried dating. Briefly, it didn't last. One girl said he looked at me like I wasn't there, like he was somewhere else entirely. And that's just it.
He was somewhere else.
Online, he found forums, videos, groups where the anger he carried was reflected back at him, louder, sharper, more focused. They didn't make fun of him there. They praised him for seeing the truth. That's when the racism sharpened, not as a belief, but as a tool, a way to explain the pain, to pin it on something, someone. He began saying things not because he believed them, but because they made him feel powerful. That's the terrifying thing about masks. The longer you wear one, the more your skin molds to its shape. Did anyone ever ask Dylann, "Are you okay?" and mean it? Every storm has a final gust, a silence before it breaks. For Dylann, that moment didn't look dramatic from the outside. No fist fight, no screaming match, just a slow unraveling until one final thread snapped. He had dropped out of school, no job, no friends. Spent hours online hunched over his laptop in a dim room with blackout curtains. There the world made sense, or at least it gave his anger a map. In those digital echo chambers, white supremacy wasn't just a belief, it was a cause. It told him what was wrong. It gave him someone to blame. He read about Trayvon Martin, about the Black Lives Matter protests. But instead of empathy, it triggered rage, a feeling that the world was shifting without him taking from him, replacing him. And then, Charleston. He drove past the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church more than once, each time slower. He later said it wasn't spontaneous. He chose that place because they were kind, because they welcomed him. That was the final twist in his thinking. He didn't just want to kill, he wanted to kill trust. He wanted the world to feel the betrayal he'd swallowed for years. There's a moment survivors remember just before he opened fire, they were praying.
And he sat there, listening.
That still haunts me, the silence before the violence. Like the world held its breath and he decided to let it go. And when he rose from his chair, was it revenge or relief? He didn't hesitate. At 8:06 p.m. on June 17, 2015, Dylann Roof stood up from his chair, pulled a Glock 45 from his fanny pack, and opened fire. 9 people fell, one by one, each shot deliberate. And all of it inside a church, the oldest black congregation in the South, a place built on survival prayer and healing. He reloaded, shot again, coldly, systematically. He wasn't rushing. Witnesses say he said almost nothing.
But what echoes in my head is what he felt in that moment.
Because this wasn't a frenzy. It was calm, calculated, controlled. People ask me all the time, what's going through a killer's mind in the act? The truth.
Sometimes clarity.
Years of silence, confusion, rejection replaced in a single moment by an overwhelming sense of power. Roof wasn't trembling. He wasn't emotional. In that twisted mental state, he believed he was doing something righteous. He later told investigators, I almost didn't go through with it because everyone was so nice. But he did. He fired into kindness.
He murdered fellowship.
Because kindness didn't undo the narrative in his head. It only made it harder to hate, and that made it unbearable. There's something chilling about someone who feels more complete while destroying others. And when the final shot echoed against the church walls, he didn't cry. He didn't run.
He just stood there.
After pulling the trigger, he didn't tremble. He smiled. He drove away slowly.
Not in panic, not in disguise. Just a quiet exit into the night.
He didn't try to cover his tracks, didn't change his clothes. He stopped at a gas station, bought a drink, sat alone in his car, like nothing had happened. But something had happened. Inside him, something had shifted, and maybe it finally matched what had always been there. In the hours that followed the massacre, Dylann Roof didn't cry. He didn't pray. He didn't show regret.
He slept.
He checked into a motel, turned on the television, lay down on a stiff bed beneath flickering lights. Surveillance footage showed him sitting still and expressionless in a plastic chair outside his room.
Not pacing, not hiding.
Just waiting. That's the part that stuck with me.
There was no escape plan.
No second act.
He had done what he believed he was meant to do.
Some criminals spiral after the act. They confess, they collapse, they beg for someone to make sense of the madness. Roof didn't spiral.
He settled.
As if for the first time he no longer needed to perform. One officer described him during arrest as eerily calm. Another said it was like arresting a mannequin. But inside something was alive, not grief, not guilt, but a twisted sense of peace. And that's the most terrifying thing about ideologically driven violence. Sometimes it leaves the perpetrator feeling whole. For the first time he felt free.
He didn't resist.
When officers pulled him over in Shelby, North Carolina, he complied. No gunfight, no escape attempt, just silence again. Back in Charleston, they placed him in an interrogation room. 4 walls, 1 metal table, no computer screens, just the sound of a ticking clock and the hum of the AC. They asked him why. He answered plainly, without hesitation. No tremble in his voice, no cracks in his posture. He even offered a confession. I had to do it, he said, because they're raping our women and taking over the country. He believed it. But what haunted me most wasn't his words. It was his eyes. Not manic, not tearful, just empty like a hallway with no door. That's where the performance stopped. Because in a courtroom you can posture.
In a manifesto you can sound larger than life.
But in a cell with no audience,
you either face yourself or you fade into your illusion.
Roof didn't cry. He didn't plead. He sat still, staring straight ahead. When they offered him food, he barely touched it. A psychologist later described him as emotionally blunted. But I wonder if the truth runs deeper, not the absence of emotion, but a complete disconnection from self. He was no longer pretending, and what remained wasn't a monster. It was smaller, emptier, almost childlike. I think of that steel chair in the cell, bolted to the floor. Cold, unmoving, just like him. Not a demon, but a frightened child in the body of a murderer.
It didn't start with a gun. It started with silence.
Long before Dylann Roof walked into that church, before the bullets, before the headlines, there were signs. Empty seats beside him in school. A father too distracted. A system that let him drift year after year into isolation. And we didn't see him. Or maybe we did, but chose to look away. When I sit across from people like him, I don't ask, what's wrong with you anymore? I ask, where did we lose you?
Because that's the real question.
There were moments, small, ordinary, forgettable, where someone could have leaned in, a teacher, a neighbor, a stranger at work, not to save him, but to see him. Instead, we labeled him odd, quiet, off. and let the mask harden. The tragedy of Charleston didn't come from nowhere. It came from years of disconnection. It came from screens replacing hands, from echo chambers replacing conversation, from pain left untreated until it turned violent. You may think this story is over, that it ended in a courtroom or a sentence or a cell, but it didn't. Because there are others walking hallways, sitting alone at lunch, scrolling in silence, carrying questions no one has answered, rage no one has calmed, hurt no one has named. And if we don't learn to notice them not as threats, but as humans, it will happen again. The crime didn't begin with blood.
It began with all the moments we refused to listen.
And right now, somewhere, there's another empty desk waiting to be filled.